December 6, 1981 marked the arrival of Amber Belolin in San Antonio, Texas. Growing up as an only child meant her parents poured all their love and attention into raising her. From an early age, Amber displayed remarkable compassion for animals. She constantly brought home strays, not just cats and dogs, but turtles, frogs, and practically any creature she encountered. Her parents welcomed them all. As she grew older, Amber set her sights on becoming a veterinarian. After graduating high school, college was the natural next step. But Amber decided to save money first, so she took a position at a video game store. Her work ethic and reliability quickly became apparent, and before long, she earned a promotion to store manager. She held that position for roughly 3 years, and in 2007, at 25 years old, she finally enrolled in veterinary classes at a local college. January 29th should have been an ordinary day. Amber was scheduled to open the store for her shift. But for reasons no one could understand, she never showed up. As manager, she was always the first to arrive. Yet that morning, nobody heard from her. When corporate noticed the store still hadn't opened, they tried calling Amber. No answer. They even called the store's landline. Silence, silence. So they contacted a nearby branch and asked an employee to drive over and investigate. An employee named Giovanni agreed to check things out. When he pulled up, the store was completely dark. Doors locked, lights off, no sign of anyone inside. He circled the building, peered through windows, but saw nothing out of the ordinary, so he left. Afterward, he reported what he'd observed to management. They kept trying to reach Amber, but got no response. Hours dragged by with no sign of her, and around noon, they called the other store again and asked Giovanni to make a second trip. Giovanni returned to the store, but this time something felt different. The lights were still off, doors still locked, but when he looked through the window, he spotted someone inside. It was another coworker named Brandon. Brandon let him in, and immediately Giovanni noticed the place was in chaos. Game boxes and merchandise littered the floor. The cash register sat open with money scattered across the counter. It looked like a robbery. Yet strangely, Brandon acted as if he didn't even see the mess. Giovanni headed to the manager's office to check the safe where the previous night's cash was normally stored. But the moment he opened the door, he froze. Lying there on the floor was a body with a plastic bag pulled tight over the head. Giovanni immediately called the police, and officers arrived within minutes. Investigators quickly confirmed the victim was Amber. After surveying the store, they reached what seemed like an obvious conclusion. She'd been killed during a robbery. The cash register was wide open, and the safe in the office had been completely emptied. Amber's car was still parked outside. The doors were unlocked, and her cell phone was sitting on the seat. That raised more questions. Why would she leave her car unlocked with all her belongings inside? Another puzzling detail was how the killer managed to exit the building. Both doors had been locked when Giovanni arrived earlier that morning. With help from other employees, detectives determined the suspect had taken more than just cash. They'd also stolen about 50 video game discs, an Xbox, and several PlayStations, totaling approximately $6,000. As police worked to piece everything together, the medical examiner concluded Amber had died from asphyxiation. It appeared the killer used a plastic bag and held it over her head until she stopped breathing. Specialists believe the struggle lasted several minutes, and throughout it, Amber fought with everything she had but couldn't escape. They also found her hands had been bound with duct tape at some point, though the killer likely removed it after she died. Detectives interviewed Amber's co-workers and learned she typically arrived at the store around 9:00 a.m., an hour before opening. Her routine involved taking cash from the safe and bringing it to the bank before preparing the store for the day. Based on their findings, Amber had arrived on time that morning, unlocked the door, and walked inside. Investigators believe the killer attacked her almost immediately, before she had the chance to collect the money. Soon after, detectives received another important lead. The manager of another store within the same chain said he'd spoken with Amber on the phone that morning. They talked briefly after she arrived at work, but the call was cut short. Amber suddenly said she needed to go and hung up. As police uncovered more details, it increasingly seemed this case involved more than a simple random robbery. For one thing, the level of violence didn't quite make sense. Amber had apparently opened both the register and the safe, meaning the killer wouldn't have needed to harm her to get the money. And if the intention had been to silence her to avoid identification, that explanation didn't fully add up either. In situations like this, robbers usually rely on a gun or a knife. Strangulation, however, often points to something more personal. On top of that, investigators believe the killer may have entered through the back door, which raised another red flag. That door opened into an alley lined with identical entrances to other businesses. So unless someone was familiar with the layout, there was no clear way to know which door led where. Taking all this into account, police began to suspect the killer might have had a personal motive and possibly even worked at the store. They now believed the robbery could have been staged to conceal what was actually a targeted murder. Even so, detectives still didn't have a single piece of physical evidence to rely on. This particular store didn't have any surveillance cameras, unlike other locations in the chain. And when crime scene technicians thoroughly searched the store, they found no usable fingerprints or DNA on the bag or on Amber's body. But by the time investigators had put all that together, they already had a suspect, Brandon. As you may recall, he was the person Giovanni saw inside the store during his second visit. Brandon was standing there in the dark with the door still locked, acting as though the chaos of the open register didn't even matter. He also told police he hadn't gone into the manager's office and hadn't seen Amber's body. According to Brandon, he arrived for his shift just minutes before Giovanni showed up. When he noticed the lights were off and the store was still locked, he assumed he must have misunderstood the schedule. Maybe it had been his responsibility to open, so he let himself inside and found the store in disarray. But instead of being alarmed, he simply assumed the overnight crew had left it that way and began worrying he would be blamed. Brandon insisted he had nothing to do with Amber's death, claimed he never saw her body, and said he had no idea anything was wrong. But detectives weren't prepared to simply accept his explanation. He knew the building thoroughly and knew there were no cameras. And on top of that, they uncovered something else, a potential motive. Amber's family and co-workers told police she'd complained about Brandon several times. He was her assistant, and according to Amber, he regularly slacked off and didn't take his job seriously. Things deteriorated to the point she decided to file a formal complaint with management and even asked that he be fired. But here was the crucial detail. Amber was planning to send that complaint on the very morning she was killed. So yes, Brandon had both motive and opportunity. But still, police didn't have a single piece of evidence tying him to the crime. They obtained a warrant to search his home, his car, and even his phone. And to their surprise, they found nothing. That was strange because the killer had taken nearly 50 game discs and 4 consoles. That property had to be somewhere, but there was no trace of it. Not in Brandon's car, not in his apartment. Even more surprising were his phone records. Information from his cell phone provider showed Brandon wasn't anywhere near the store until around 2 p.m. while Amber was killed sometime around 9 that morning. On top of that, he claimed to have an alibi. He said he spent that morning helping his fiancée and her parents, and when police followed up, they all confirmed his account. Even so, investigators weren't ready to remove Brandon from consideration. For the next several days, they rechecked his alibi and tried to determine whether there was any possible way he could have committed the crime. Meanwhile, Amber's funeral took place, and to everyone's shock, Brandon attended. By that point, her entire family knew he was the primary suspect, so seeing him there felt like a slap in the face. Eventually, however, detectives confirmed his alibi was airtight. There was simply no way he could have been at the store that morning. So despite the red flags and his strange behavior, they had no choice but to rule him out and begin looking elsewhere. They also looked into Amber's boyfriend, a man named Fred. Just minutes before her death, she texted him, "I love you." But, like Brandon, Fred had an unbreakable alibi. Once again, police found themselves back at square one. Sometime later, investigators held a press conference alongside Amber's parents, asking the public to come forward with any information related to the case. A massive reward of $100,000 was announced, with most of it contributed by the store where Amber had worked. Over the following weeks, tips began pouring in. But one after another, they all led nowhere. Gradually, the case went cold. And as months passed without answers, detectives began to wonder whether justice would ever be done. That continued for 7 months until the case suddenly took an unexpected turn. Police received a call from a man who wanted to remain anonymous. He claimed he had information about Amber's murder, though at first he was vague and hesitant. Still, sometime later, he agreed to meet with detectives and share what he knew. According to this witness, the day before Amber was killed, a friend of his had suggested they carry out an easy robbery. He refused the offer at the time, choosing to walk away, but everything changed the very next day. When he turned on the news and saw reports confirming Amber had been murdered, it immediately clicked in his mind who could be responsible. The realization came quickly because someone he personally knew worked at the same retail chain as Amber. However, that person was not Brandon as some might have assumed. It was Giovanni. According to the witness, he met with Giovanni the day after the murder took place, and during that meeting, the conversation took a disturbing turn. Giovanni didn't hint or imply. He openly admitted he was the one who had killed Amber. The witness said the confession left him stunned and deeply shaken. Despite the severity of what he just heard, he didn't go to the police right away. Fear controlled his decision. He believed that if Giovanni was capable of murdering Amber, he might just as easily silence him next. What made the witness's account even more significant was the personal connection between everyone involved. The witness knew both Giovanni and Amber well. At one point, all three of them had worked together at the same store for a period of time. Because of that shared history, Giovanni would have been fully aware of how the store operated. He would have known there were no security cameras inside, and he also would have known Amber trusted him. That trust meant he could have easily entered the store that morning without raising any suspicion, because Amber wouldn't have hesitated to let him inside. Not long after these details came to light, police brought Giovanni in for questioning. During the interrogation, Giovanni denied every allegation. He insisted repeatedly he had nothing to do with Amber's murder. Pressed him hard, applying pressure from multiple angles, but no matter what tactics they used, Giovanni never confessed. In the absence of a confession or tangible proof, investigators reached a dead end. Eventually, they had no choice but to let him go. With no physical evidence tying him directly to the crime, detectives began to question whether the witness's testimony on its own would be strong enough to move forward with formal charges and a trial. Those concerns were shared by the district attorney. After reviewing the case, he made it clear he was not convinced. He told investigators that without solid concrete evidence, something beyond a statement, there was almost no chance of persuading a jury to convict. As a last-ditch effort, investigators decided to obtain a DNA sample from Giovanni. The hope was not necessarily that it would match anything immediately, but that the pressure of being compelled to give his DNA might rattle him or prompt a mistake. Even though there was no usable biological evidence recovered from the crime scene, they believed the process itself could have an impact. They secured a warrant, went to Giovanni's home, and collected the sample. Still, Giovanni remained calm, denied all involvement, and continued to maintain his innocence. Then just one day later, something else happened that caught investigators' attention. Detectives learned Giovanni had suddenly left town with his wife and children. The family had relocated to Laredo, a city located right near the Mexican border. To law enforcement, this move felt like a serious red flag. It raised immediate concerns about flight and the possibility Giovanni might attempt to cross into Mexico. However, without concrete evidence, their hands were tied. They couldn't legally arrest him. And now they faced the growing fear that if he disappeared across the border, finding him again would be far more difficult. Over the next several months, police continued to dig, hoping for a break in the case. They followed up on tips, re-examined leads, and revisited old information, but nothing new surfaced. Time passed, and eventually a year and a half went by. As the case grew colder, it began to feel as though Giovanni might never be held accountable for Amber's death. Then, without warning, detectives received a phone call, one that would completely change the direction of the investigation. It was June 2008, 18 months after Amber's murder, and the person on the line was a woman named Veronica. What immediately stood out was who she was: Giovanni's wife. wife. She told detectives she'd never believed her husband was involved in Amber's death at first, but that changed the day police came to collect his DNA. As soon as the officers left, Giovanni turned to her and said they needed to pack their things and prepare to move. When she asked what was happening, he told her the police suspected him of murder. Veronica then asked him directly if he'd killed someone. He looked her straight in the eyes and said yes. She instantly understood he was talking about Amber, but she was too afraid to argue or deny it. According to Veronica, Giovanni had always been aggressive and controlling. He monitored her constantly and refused to accept no when it came to intimacy. If she resisted, he would restrain her with duct tape and force himself on her. He didn't care that their children were asleep in the same room. They were all living in a one-bedroom apartment. She believed that if she ever went to the police, he would kill her, so she stayed silent, moved with him, and did whatever she could to survive. Eventually, she found the courage to ask him directly if he'd killed Amber, and Giovanni confirmed he had. He also said it happened during a robbery. Veronica pleaded with him to turn himself in, but he refused. Because of that, she told him she wanted a divorce and intended to take the children with her. In response, Giovanni suggested they talk things over calmly while getting coffee. Instead of driving to a cafe, he took her to a remote area, locked the car doors, and pulled out a gun. She begged him not to kill her, but Giovanni ignored her pleas. He sexually assaulted her at gunpoint, and then, without warning, he did something she never expected. He handed her the gun and told her to shoot him. Veronica refused. She managed to convince him that if he died and she went to prison for killing him, their 2 children would lose both parents. Eventually, he calmed down and drove her back home. The following day, Giovanni drove her and the children to her mother's house, then left. As soon as he was gone, Veronica contacted the police. With her statement, the district attorney finally authorized an arrest. But there was a major issue. Giovanni's exact location was unknown, and detectives believed he'd already crossed into Mexico. They reached out to the U.S. Marshals, who placed him on their list of the 15 most wanted fugitives and began coordinating with Mexican authorities to locate him. The process took roughly a month and a half until Mexican officials finally found Giovanni at a relative's home. He was just across the U.S. border, only a few miles away. In a cruel twist of irony, when authorities arrested him, he was playing one of the very video games he'd stolen from the store on the day Amber was killed. Under the extradition agreement between the United States and Mexico, bringing Giovanni back to Texas came with one condition. Prosecutors had to remove the death penalty as a possible sentence. They didn't really have a choice, so they agreed. Later, they decided to offer Giovanni a plea deal because, without the death penalty, the district attorney saw little reason to drag the case through a trial that could last years. As part of the agreement, Giovanni was required to plead guilty in exchange for a life sentence with the possibility of parole after 30 years. He accepted the deal and finally gave his version of what happened that morning. According to him, he never intended to kill Amber and only wanted to steal some money because he'd recently lost his job. At first, he claimed she complied with everything he demanded. But at some point, she tried to call for help. That, he said, was when he killed her. But detectives didn't believe that explanation for a moment. First of all, Giovanni hadn't lost his job. He was still employed at another store at the time of the murder. Second, the idea he hadn't planned to kill her didn't make sense either. Amber knew who he was. Even if he'd escaped after the robbery, she could have easily told police exactly who to look for. Giovanni also claimed he'd felt guilty the entire time and had even considered turning himself in, but said he kept putting other people's needs ahead of his own, whatever that was supposed to mean. As part of the plea agreement, Giovanni was only required to give a partial confession, so some details about what truly happened that day remain unknown. In the end, he was sentenced to prison. The earliest date he'll be eligible for parole is 2038. After the sentencing, Amber's parents made it clear they would fight with everything they had to make sure he never walks free. And finally, there's Brandon, the man police initially suspected of Amber's murder. For weeks, detectives treated him like the killer, and everyone around him, his family and his friends, knew he was under suspicion. Investigators even attempted to pressure his fiancée into turning him in. They asked her how she could sleep next to a murderer and warned her she might be his next victim. Despite all that, police never officially informed Brandon he was no longer a suspect. For a long time, he lived with the fear he could go to prison for a crime he didn't commit, and the people around him had no idea he'd been cleared. In the end, however, Brandon was able to rebuild his life. He got married, started a family, and in 2018, he even saved a young girl's life. At that time, he was working as a truck driver, and while passing a drainage canal, he noticed a 13-year-old girl being swept away by the current. There'd been a heavy storm, and the canal was overflowing. She couldn't escape on her own, so Brandon rushed over to help. With assistance from others, they brought over a ladder, and the girl climbed out. She spent several days in the hospital, but she survived, thanks entirely to Brandon. If you found this case fascinating, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. We post crime case videos every night. Until next time, stay sharp, stay vigilant.